So anybody who wasn't here in the morning, my name is Cam Smith. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm excited to introduce our two panelists. We'll do it the same as we have for the previous ones. I'll start with Ash, and then after Ash has spoken, then I will introduce Riley. So Ash Zemenick earned a doctorate in ecology at UC Davis and then took a postdoctoral fellowship at Auburn University. There, Zemenick researched the importance of diversifying and humanizing scientist role models on student outcomes. At a concurrent postdoctoral fellowship at Michigan State University, Zemenick helped create and direct Project Biodiversity, a repository of teaching materials and methods to diversify, humanize, and increase inclusivity in biology classrooms. Part of this effort includes holding workshops for instructors to learn about inclusive teaching methods, particularly for subjects related to the biology of sex and gender. They also managed a mobile plant nursery in Sacramento that assists people seeking to incorporate native plants into their landscaping. Today, Zemenick's varied interests include ecology and environmental science involving plants, insects, microbes, ecological networks, natural history, and discipline-based education research. They look forward to spending time in naturalizing, backpacking, climbing, and biking in their new mountain home.
Okay, it's all happening. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for sticking with me during that little snafu, and also for being here this afternoon. I'm so honored to be here with you all during this amazing workshop and symposium. As mentioned, my name is Ash Zemenick, and my pronouns are they or he. And I'm the manager of UC Berkeley's Sage Hen Creek Field Station, where people come to do science and have classes outside in the Sierra Nevada. Today I'm going to tell you the story behind designing methods for embracing gender and sexual diversity in post-secondary biology classrooms. And you likely gleaned from that very kind introduction that I'm a biology and ecology enthusiast. And I went to school for a very long time, like a lot of you here too. So even before I went to college, I took as many biology courses as I could in high school. So this included like biology, AP biology, physiology, microbiology, anything I could fit into my schedule. Then I went to college at University of Michigan, and I majored in ecology and evolutionary biology. And I took as many biology courses as I could. I even took graduate classes. They let me take those for some reason. And then I went right to my PhD in ecology at UC Davis, and I took even more classes in biology and ecology. But it took me until the end of graduate school and onto my two postdocs at Michigan State and Auburn to kind of realize that my education had been incomplete, and especially in regards to the biology of sex and gender. First, it had been hugely biased towards teaching animal systems, which tend to sexually reproduce instead of asexually reproduce. It led me to believe that basically all sexually reproducing species had quote-unquote males and females, or sperm producers and egg producers. And it made me think that all males and females become males and females through having XX or XY chromosomes, and that all males were aggressive and that all females were coy and picky. So basically, my education left me with this notion that most of nature mirrored what society thinks of human biology. So basically, I thought that most individuals of species could be split up easily into males and females that had XX or XY chromosomes, and that they exhibited these traditional gender norms. This is a real slide I found on the internet yesterday. In reality, as hopefully we know, this gave me a very small view of humans and that of the entire tree of life. So as you can see, animals are just a very small branch of all organisms on the earth, circled in the red right there. In reality, many species, like the entire kingdom of fungi, don't have males and females at all. They don't produce eggs and sperm. They produce spores that are all the same size when they mate. And not all sperm producers and egg producers become sperm or egg producers because of X or Y chromosomes. Instead, the environment can determine an individual's sex. So like whether the environment is hot or cold, or fertilization patterns of parents can impact whether something produces eggs or sperm, or even parasites that an individual carries can influence whether something will go on to produce eggs or sperm. So it's pretty amazing. I also learned later in life that plants, like in plants, most flowers have both male and female organs at the same time. And in fact, very few individual plants can be split up into males and females at all. And that even among animals, sperm producers and egg producers can be really hard to distinguish from one another, like these eels that you can see right here. And that sperm producers can become egg producers at some point in their lives. So for example, if Finding Nemo got it right, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, if they got it right, Marlin, Nemo's dad here on the right, would have grown in size and started producing eggs when Nemo's mom died at the beginning of the movie. So that's what should have really happened in the movie. It would have been way better, in my opinion. I learned later in life that some animals develop as gynandromorphs. So these are individuals that contain both typically male and typically female secondary sex characteristics, like this butterfly here. This can happen in birds, insects, all other, like lots of types of animals. And of course, human-ascribed gender roles don't apply to all animals. So you might know that seahorses, the males give birth to the babies. So why could I have gotten all of this formal education from institutions with these very fancy seals and not learn an accurate view of the diversity of sexual systems on Earth? We could probably have very long academic and social and political conversations about this, but it intrigued me and it really angered me and a few of my friend colleagues and I. So what we did is basically take it upon ourselves to teach ourselves about the true diversity of sex and gender diversity in nature and how it should really be taught. And so we combed through about half a dozen currently used biology textbooks, and we found that the way sex and gender topics are taught are often full of what we call the 3 O's. So omissions, oversimplifications, and overgeneralizations. And it's important as students and as educators to be aware of this and to work to correct how we approach teaching sex and gender-related topics in biology and across disciplines. So omission is the avoidance of sex and gender-related topics and or omitting key societal context and meaning when certain topics are taught. Oversimplification is our tendency to rely on false binaries or black and white thinking when we're learning and when we're teaching. And this leads to overgeneralization, which erases the diversity of the natural world as well as the identities and experiences of many people. So in particular, the way things are taught tend to frame things outside of what we think of the average as weird or as other. And one of the most basic pitfalls in terms of omissions that we see in relation to sex and gender in biology is pretty basic, that sex is never defined clearly. In all of the textbooks we found, you look in the text, there's no bolded term for sex. You look in the glossary, there's no entry for sex. Yet it's talked about all the time. So in some ways, this is understandable because sex can refer to so many things in biology and in our society and in our culture. It can mean the act, like copulation, reproduction, genetic mixing, or courtship behaviors in biology. Sometimes it's defined by the chromosomes or genitalia or hormones or the appearance that an individual is born with or might develop over time. However, all of these definitions of sex address levels of biological organization that are highly complex and variable, which is to say that sex has so many meanings and connotations that we find it to be too fraught to be useful in the classroom if it's left undefined. And importantly, leaving it undefined while still using the word constantly leaves students to assume that you're talking about their concept of what defines sex, wherever that concept might be derived from. And given how contentious this is and how carelessly this topic can be thrown around and used as a lightning rod in news and politics these days, this can lead to some really unfortunate extrapolations and inaccuracies. So we therefore find that if you need a definition of sex in biological research or in the classroom, it's helpful to use a really simple one based on gamete size, and we call this gametic sex. So you can choose other traits as well, and I'll explain why we typically choose gametic sex in biology in particular. But the most important thing to do here is to use this qualifier before sex. So I'm not calling this biological sex as an umbrella term for everything. I'm calling this gametic sex, and you can do the same thing. You could say chromosomal sex, you could say reproductive sex, you could say behavioral sex, but right now I'm just going with gametic sex. So why gametic sex? Well, gametes are specialized cells that organisms use for sexual reproduction, and the definition of gametic sex in biological research that's often used is simply defined by the size of the gamete an individual produces. So small gametes are sperm, and by convention, those are called the male gamete. Large gametes are called eggs, and by convention are called the female gamete. We want to be clear, we don't think gametic sex should define human gender or sex, especially in socially contentious issues like who should play which sports. That doesn't make any sense. Many kids who play sports don't even make gametes yet. Gametes have nothing to do with your ability to play anything. Doesn't make any sense. It's also important to note that this is not a binary categorization when scaled up to any level of biological organization beyond the single gamete scale. So many organisms can produce both sizes of gametes, like Nemo's dad would have been. Remember the clownfish? Then there are also many organisms that have equally sized gametes, and this is called isogamy. So remember fungi, like I told you about before, they make spores, and those are equal sized gametes. So they don't even make eggs and sperm. So on top of that, the point I want to stress is that all other traits that tend to be associated with gamete size, like chromosomes or the size of a body or coloration of a body or anything like that, are secondary, and they're variable both within and among individuals. So this includes genitalia, hormones, chromosomes, behavior, etc. These do not always correlate or correspond with gametic sex. And so this is why gametic sex should not define human gender or sex. So all of these secondary characteristics fall into the purview of the study of sex determination and sex-associated dimorphism, which is the phenomena in which individuals of the same species tend to have different genotypes and or phenotypes associated with gamete production. So like egg producers look or act differently than sperm producers. So we like to think about this as sex-associated N-morphisms, since the prefix di implies that all of these varied phenomena are binary, which they definitely aren't. So we're trying to get the field to adopt this term, which I don't think they know we exist yet, so we're working on that. This rapidly evolving field is full of complexities, variation, and caveats, but one thing is true, that the degree of difference between sex-associated traits varies within and across species. It's a distribution, not a binary. And while we can lump some organisms into categories of gametic sex based on gamete sizes, that's just one of many traits that we associate with sex, and all of the variation in those traits cause these categories to have far more overlap than is usually acknowledged or appreciated. So why does this matter? Well, that's of course a huge topic, but one reason is that when you don't define sex clearly in the classroom, your students might conflate it with gender. So gender identity is how you in your head think about yourself. It's based on social concepts of what it means to be a man, woman, neither, or both. Gender identity does not have to be the same as the gamete size you produce or any other secondary characteristics you might have that might be associated with gamete size or not. So whenever we talk about organisms in biology or in the classroom, we should never discuss their gender, like of a turtle or something like that. It doesn't make any sense. We may or may not know what gamete size they produce, so we can talk about their gametic sex, the appearance of their sex, or whatever we want to talk about, but we shouldn't talk about their gender, and this distinction should always be made clear. Another reason is that the way it's taught, the biological basis of sex-associated behavior and secondary characteristics are overstated in biology. And so that is to say, I think that we care about an organism's sex way more than we should. So it's just like another thing to add to a data sheet. Like we're like talking about oh, we're looking at turtles, let's look at like their size, their age. Why don't we just log their sex too? And we need to ask ourselves, if we're doing science or we're doing a science experiment in class, why do we need to know the organism's sex? It's just something that we automatically add, and maybe there's a reason why we need to understand it, but like, why do we automatically always want to log it? I think that should be a question that scientists always ask themselves, including students. I think that this automatic reaction to always include it makes variation both within and across species harder to understand for students and scientists as well. I think that this others variation in sex-associated secondary characteristics like body form, size, and genitalia, and sex-associated behaviors like parental roles, courtship, mating, and so on. So for example, calling a fish with more than 2 sex-associated phenotypes, like these fish here have 2 different types of males. The bigger male, which is in the middle, and then what's called the sneaker male, which mimics the female, and that one's on the right. So they've got 2 morphs of males. This science article calls the fish gender bending and weird, which might seem like, to some people, a cute or engaging way to talk about fish. Weirdos. But it can lead to really reinforcing biological essentialist views about what is natural versus what is weird, and that can then be weaponized against people in both subtle and not so subtle ways. And not just against those with diverse sexualities and gender expressions and identities, but also against those with intersex characteristics. So if you're not familiar, intersex refers to those with secondary sex characteristics that don't fit binary definitions of male and female bodies. And close to 1 out of every 200 human births has intersex characteristics. So educators, if you teach a lot of students, you almost certainly have students with intersex characteristics in your classroom, which you may be unintentionally harming with binary frameworks of sex-associated secondary characteristics. So being accurate and inclusive about how much variation in sex-associated traits exists in nature helps everyone understand that rather than being weird or other, we're all part of the natural variation that exists everywhere. So after learning all of these pitfalls, Alex Webster, Sarah Jones, my postdoc advisor, Marjorie Weber, and I created Project Biodiversify. And as part of that, a 2.5-hour workshop, which we have delivered to many different universities across the country. And in these workshops, we basically teach instructors how they can update their lessons and teach sex and gender-related topics in more inclusive and accurate ways. And we recently turned the ideas of our workshop into a paper that we've just published last year in Bioscience. And it's called 6 Principles for Embracing Gender and Sexual Diversity in Post-Secondary Biology Classrooms. Quick shout out to my co-authors, because without them, none of this work would be possible. So thank you to Sean Turney, Alex Webster, Sarah Jones, and Marjorie Weber. Our 6 principles for embracing gender and sexual diversity in post-secondary biology classrooms are to 1, present diversity first, 2, to provide social and historical context with your examples, 3, to use inclusive language and definitions, 4, to show the iterative process of science and not just leave things as immutable facts, 5, to diversify the role models presented in the classroom, and 6, to cultivate a culture of respect in the classroom. So I'm just going to go through a couple of these, but if you're curious about the details, you can check our paper out or get in contact with me. So our first principle is to teach diversity first. So the idea behind this is to move from teaching topics using human-centric, heteronormative examples and concepts first to introducing concepts in light of biological diversity and variation across scales first, and then go to those human or animal examples next. So here are some examples for an introduction to the topic of sexual reproduction. So instead of leading with humans or a subset of animals that reproduce just like humans, we suggest leading with a variety of reproductive systems like the ones you see here. And for the topic of sex determination, we suggest presenting the newest research on sex determination systems, which are extremely diverse and can evolve really quickly. So again, it's not just those XX and XY systems. And finally, here are some examples on variation in sex-associated endomorphisms. So you can see that some species are extremely dimorphic across species, like those crabs on the right, or some are really similar, like those eels on the left, and some have multiple morphs within sexes, like those fish I already showed you earlier in the middle. So the idea is that by presenting diversity first, students learn that variation and diversity in sexual reproduction strategies, sex determination systems, and sex-associated behaviors is the rule in biology rather than the exception. And learning this makes it much easier for students to understand why there is so much variation in humans and across the tree of life, and that there's nothing fundamentally unnatural about not fitting into one of two boxes, either in their gender identity, their behavior, or in their sexuality. So you might be worried that teaching all of this diversity might be too much cognitive load for your students. I can give you some reassurance in this area. First, education research is showing that highlighting complexity can actually enhance student learning. And specifically on sex and gender-related topics, soon-to-be published work by our friend Sarah Spalding has found that presenting diversity first in animal behavior classes did not negatively impact student objectives in learning. Okay, our second principle is to provide social and historical context for students when teaching topics related to sex and gender in biology. So the idea here is to move from omitting the social and historical context of key biological research findings to noting when a term is used differently in social versus biological contexts. So here we suggest carefully defining a term and providing examples of how science is influenced by the social and cultural context of which it's being or was conducted. So providing context has also been shown to be an effective teaching method. So for example, providing historical context can help students problem solve and understand how science works. And furthermore, explicitly addressing misconceptions widespread in society can actually be a way to engage students in the classroom. So for example, you might be teaching about how common hermaphroditism is in the natural world. So hermaphroditism refers to organisms that can produce both small and large gametes, either simultaneously or sequentially throughout their lives, just like Nemo and the clownfish I talked about earlier. So it's awesome to teach this because it presents diversity first and allows students to understand that not all, or even most species in the world are easily divided up into males and females. But it's really important to note that the term hermaphrodite has a really different meaning in biology than it does in human society. And in fact, we might even think about changing it because that term is a really derogatory term for intersex and trans people. And so mentioning that this term does not apply to people could really dampen the use of this derogatory term in your classroom and make your classroom more inclusive to trans and intersex people. So in general, for terms that are used in biology and by society, we believe it's imperative to intentionally and clearly differentiate their uses and maybe update your terms in your biology courses. Okay, and last I'd like to tell you about our fourth principle for teaching sex and gender in more inclusive and accurate ways, which is to show the iterative process of science. So to do this, we suggest moving from presenting a theory or a model as it stood in the time a textbook was written without providing any additional context, like this is the model, this is the way it is, that's how it is forever, to pointing out the holes in our current understanding of nature and to show where research is going now. So teaching how scientists use models rather than presenting immutable facts is a primary goal of new educational standards, and it's been shown to be more effective and engaging than simply presenting facts. So we emphasize showing students that science is an iterative process and teaching them how scientists view, use, test, and refine models. So we use them to simplify and understand complexity, but we're constantly retesting them as scientists. So for example, if you teach sexual selection theory, which basically explains why like peacocks are peacocks, like why the males have like, you know, the feathers. It's a model for explaining the evolution of sex-associated traits in many species. The model we often teach in courses is based primarily on really early research and the biological essentialist idea that females are caring and choosy and males are competitive. So that's what's still in textbooks today, like that slide I showed you earlier. That's what's taught. And we often focus on highly sexually dimorphic species that exemplify what we think of as traditional sex roles, like these elephant seals I'm showing on the slide here. However, more recent research has called attention to the fact that this model doesn't do a great job of explaining the variation we see in sex-associated traits across the entire biological world. So when we introduce this model in our classes, we're leaving out instances which the males do child rearing, or where females are aggressive, or where males and females have almost identical morphology and behavior, or where there are more than 2 sex-associated phenotypes. So we can call attention to the fact that new data has caused scientists to revise the models of sexual selection to try to explain all of these other species that don't fit those models of super heteronormative life. So with these 6 principles, it's our hope that students will get a fuller view of the true biology of natural systems in regards to sex and gender than I did in my many, many years in school. And further, it's our hope that with these 6 principles, queer and trans students or students from non-nuclear families will feel more included in their biology classrooms and potentially no longer feel unnatural. And we want to note that we can implement all of these 6 principles while avoiding the appeal to nature fallacy, which holds that anything in nature is inherently good and something must be bad because it's unnatural. So we're not trying to say that diversity in nature or examples in nature are inherently good, or that we should necessarily look to nature for examples to identify with, because that can get like a little bit tricky. People don't need nature to explain them. People, especially queer and trans people, don't need to be explained by anything. You are explained by the fact that you exist. And so as I like to word it, does it give me comfort, curiosity, and joy knowing that there are transsexual organisms in nature? Yes. But do they need to exist in nature to validate my existence? No. I exist, and therefore I am. So with that, I want to say thank you again so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and thanks again, for having me.